I try to imagine a fellow smarter than myself, and then I try to think, what would he do?
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. I am your host, Jesse Lawler, excited to bring you a inaugural New Year's 2014 edition of this podcast, where we like to talk about anything that you can do to improve your brain in ways that Mother Nature may or may not have ever intended. We're going to be talking about caffeine this week. Caffeine is it's a drug that I've been wanting to have an expert on this show on for a long time. I'm not sure if that sentence made any sense, but you probably know what I'm getting at. Caffeine is something that almost all of us use on a highly frequent, if not daily basis, and it's considered a cognitive enhancer, if not a nootropic, by pretty much everybody. And so given that it's the most prevalent cognitive enhancer in the world by a long shot, we're long overdue for an episode about it. Anyway, we're going to get to that with Dr. Laura Juliano from the American University in Washington, D.C. in the main interview for this episode. But before we do that, let me promise you that if you hang around until the end of the episode, in the Ruthless Listener Retention Gimmick, I'm going to tell you a way that you can dramatically improve your skills without doing any, what you would traditionally consider work on them. I should also point out that as we kick off this new year, we've got a lot of I'm doing another interview tomorrow morning, and we've got a couple of them lined up over the next week. So I'm starting to finally build up a backlog of interviews, which is what I really need to make this podcast the weekly thing that it was always meant to be, and is finally about to start being. So anyway, thank you very much to Ben Pomeroy, who's the man most directly responsible for filling the pipeline with the upcoming interviews. I'm very, very excited about that. We've got everybody from a multiply published author to an ex-Navy SEAL that are going to be interviews in the very near future, and of course the normal gamut of neuroscience folks that we have on as interviewees. So a lot of good stuff coming up. But anyway, let's delve over into This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts, This Week in Neuroscience.
Okay, so this is a misnomer episode of This Week in Neuroscience, because this is actually an article that I came across from back in 2009, but it was so interesting that I wanted to bring it to your attention. I'm going to put a link to it, of course, and I'm going to try to find an expert on this for a future episode of Smart Drug Smarts to have an interview entirely devoted to this subject, which is people that have had some sort of brain injury or a stroke or a brain tumor or something like that, and counterintuitively, rather than just having negative effects from it, which is often happens in these cases also, including the ones we're about to talk about, these people have gotten some sort of cognitive superpower, be it artistic or mathematical or musical, as a result of a, what we would think of as a brain problem. This article has 10 different visual artists, each of whom, they're very different styles and stuff, obviously, but each of them had either at birth or sometime subsequent to birth a severe brain problem, which is largely credited for the artistic heights that they've gone on to afterwards. And there's everything from digital artists to hand-drawn stuff, people that have had deep levels of autism since birth, to one guy who became a graphic artist for electronic arts at like 52 years old after having done really nothing related to that in his previous time before having brain troubles. So yeah, I'm going to throw up this link. Check it out. I just found it really fascinating, and expect an episode of Smart Drug Smarts circling around this topic in the near future. I think this is a really fascinating one.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So we are about to be talking with Dr. Laura Juliano of the American University. She supervises the Behavioral Pharmacology and Health Promotion Lab there, a human experimental and clinical research lab within the Department of Psychology. She's an expert on caffeine and smoking, among other things, and has had media appearances on everything from NPR and the Wall Street Journal to Allure magazine. You can probably hear it in my voice when I'm talking to her in the interview coming up here. I was on caffeine at the time, as most of us frequently are, but I was also just really excited to finally get an expert on about caffeine because, it's something that's a daily part of most of our lives, and there's obviously a lot more we could know about it than most of us probably do, including myself. So let's dive right in.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So yes, it is true that is the world's most widely consumed drug. 85 to 90% of people consume at least one drink or one, substance containing caffeine a day. As far as regulations, there's no legal age to purchase caffeine. You can purchase large amounts on the internet if you were interested, but there are some regulations that we could get into if you would like in terms of how much caffeine can be put into a product. that's an interesting conversation.
Let's go there since we're on that topic. I mean, I know that, like Jolt Cola was something that was really popular for a while when I was in high school and college. I don't think they have Jolt Cola anymore, but they certainly have all the Red Bulls and stuff like that. And you occasionally hear about horror stories. So what are sort of the upper limits that the FDA turns up its nose at?
So in terms of soft drinks, which are consumed pretty good rates in the U.S. and around the world, at least in the U.S., there are limits. So manufacturers cannot put more than, for a 12-ounce serving, 71.5 milligrams of caffeine in that serving. So that is regulated. Now, it's funny that you mentioned Jolt Cola because I spoke with them a while back. They are no longer around as far as I can tell, but they switched over to the energy drink market.
Right.
And the reason they did that was because, they were sort of the ones, I think they had 69 milligrams in a 12-ounce soda, and that was sort of like the high-dose caffeine back in the day. And then energy drinks started coming out that didn't have any regulations because they can be considered dietary supplements, not soft drinks. So once you throw the label of dietary supplement on an energy drink, they no longer fall under those rules, and they can pretty much do whatever they want. And so Joel's, I think their attitude was, well, why would we continue to call ourselves a soft drink when we're losing out on this whole market here of energy drinks? So right now, this is a very important issue, and there has been more attention put towards some sort of regulation in energy drinks, because right now you can pick up an energy drink, and the same size energy drink can have anywhere from 80 milligrams of caffeine, which that's typically what you find in a Red Bull, an 8-ounce can of Red Bull, upwards of 400, at times 500 milligrams of caffeine for the same substance. And because it's not labeled, and manufacturers of energy drinks are not required to place the amount of caffeine on their labels, they only have to say that it's been added if they add it. I think consumers are really in a very sort of precarious situation in that, you could have 80 milligrams, it makes you feel okay, you like it, and then you grab another one and all of a sudden you're having caffeine intoxication symptoms. And there have been some reports of alleged or associated deaths that the FDA is currently investigating. And I know there's some legislation in works to try to get some hold on the amount of caffeine that is contained in not only energy drinks, but these sort of energy shots and other very small volume, but high dose caffeine substances.
Yeah, let's give people some context for these numbers, because I know that a lot of people, when they think about caffeine, they're thinking, maybe in terms of what the analogy to a cup of coffee is. They might not know what 100 milligrams feels like or 200 milligrams feels like. I guess I want to say, just for a point of reference, I've actually got something called Smart Caffeine, which is a combination of caffeine plus L-theanine capsules here. And one capsule is 100 milligrams. So to think that there might be energy drinks that are 400 or pushing on 500 milligrams, that blows me out of the water. I didn't think you were going to name a number that high.
Yeah, well, the last, I always update these numbers when, I write a new chapter. The highest I could find this year was about 375 milligrams, but that's still a very, very large dose of caffeine, especially for a non-tolerant user.
Yeah.
So to put it in perspective, the first thing that needs to be addressed anytime we're talking about caffeine is individual variability, because there is such a wide range of different effects in terms of severity that people can experience from the same dose of caffeine, because there appears to be very large differences in metabolism. People who are tolerant to the drug will have a different effect than people who are not tolerant. Some people are just sort of naturally sensitive, which may be mediated by their genetics. So we can't just say a 100 milligram dose will be the same for every person, but in general, let's say an average, a soft drink might contain about 50 milligrams of caffeine, a 12-ounce serving of a soft drink. Let's say like a Diet Coke has 45 milligrams of caffeine. A cup of coffee can vary because it's not added to coffee or tea or chocolate. It occurs naturally in those substances. There's a lot of variability, but a 12-ounce cup of coffee would contain somewhere between 100 and, I hate to say this, 400 milligrams of caffeine, just because there's so much variability in brewing and so forth. So, but the average person, there was just data collected, they were just published this month of the U.S. population. The average person is still consuming less than 300 milligrams of caffeine a day.
Gotcha. And the sort of the danger zone, at which point, like, you start worrying about actual short-term negative consequences, maybe rather than long-term negative consequences, is how high. Like, I know that the LD50, the point at which you're likely to drop dead, is ridiculously high, but it's still a pretty safe drug as drugs go. Yeah.
Well, the average dose is anywhere between 20 and 200 milligrams, for sort of when we look at the acute effects of the drug. So that those in general at that dose range, people have good effects. They would have beneficial effects unless they're highly sensitive. When you start getting above an acute dose of 200 milligrams, moving into 300 and 400 milligrams, people start to experience adverse effects from caffeine. So they'll experience anxiety, jitteriness. If they're sensitive to anxiety, it could even induce, let's say, a panic attack. So there is a sort of a very clear dose effect of the drug. Low doses people tend to like, and they tend to drink or consume products in those ranges. And then at higher doses, they start to feel bad and they'll limit their caffeine. But in terms of the lethal dose, about 100 cups of coffee is the lethal dose, about 5 to 10 grams of caffeine. We talk about caffeine dosage in terms of milligrams,
right?
Thousandth of a gram. But in terms of the lethal dose, it's about 5 to 10 grams. Now, unfortunately, there are cases of accidental overdose and intentional overdose of caffeine, but it is very rare.
Intentional overdose, like somebody tried to commit suicide by drinking a couple barrels of coffee at a time, or?
Well, usually it's pills. There are energy aids that come in 1 to 200 milligrams. Yeah, it's not I wouldn't say it's a good way to die.
Yeah, that seems like a very roundabout way of committing suicide.
Yeah, I think it's probably the availability, that it's easy to get that amount of caffeine. And then I think there was recently an accidental overdose. Somebody just purchased some caffeine powder or something on the internet and didn't realize how potent the stuff was and did overdose.
So we've been talking so far, I guess we've been on the sort of the negative side of things. Can you tell us a little bit, I guess, first of all, about what actually is the active mechanism of caffeine within the brain, the cognitive differences that we see on it? What's that coming from?
So as far as the neurobiology, caffeine is structurally similar to a neuromodulator in the brain called adenosine. And it's very, very important neuromodulator. Its primary role appears to be inducing sleepiness or fatigue. So throughout the day, adenosine levels build up. And when they're high, we feel sleepy and tired and we go to sleep. It has other effects, but in general, caffeine, because it's structurally similar to adenosine, it antagonizes adenosine receptors. So when adenosine would normally be in the receptor, and caffeine now binds with that receptor and blocks the effects of adenosine so that it creates opposite effects. And that's why we feel less sleepy and we feel energetic, and it wards off fatigue, because adenosine can't bind and sort of send those messages that we feel sleepy or tired. And it's very effective. It's very effective at doing so. So at the end of the day, if somebody needs to take a long drive and they don't want to fall asleep at the wheel, I would recommend consuming caffeine to ward off that adenosine activity. Now, it also has effects in the brain because of its antagonism of adenosine. Adenosine interacts with other neurotransmitters in the brain. So there's very strong interactions with dopamine and glutamate and a lot of other neurotransmitters. So it's a very complicated drug in terms of its neuropharmacology.
So there's still more adenosine floating around that could have other effects because they're no longer plugged into their normal lock and key places?
Not that the adenosine is having effects, but receptors sort of talk to each other, right? There's the interaction. And so one of the very important neurotransmitters in the brain is dopamine. Dopamine has effects on a lot of things. Our motor movement, and caffeine does increase motor activity. It has effects on the reward centers of the brain, what allows us to feel pleasure and want to take a drug again over and over. Appears to be mediated by a reward center in the brain, and caffeine has been shown as well, like all drugs that people take for pleasure or for recreation, to stimulate dopamine in the reward centers of the brain.
That was one of the things I was reading about. And so caffeine, in plants is...
Insecticide?
Yes, thank you. Caffeine in plants is an insecticide, but then I guess for certain types of insects, the kind that are supposed to pollinate the plants, it actually sort of stimulates their reward centers and makes it more likely that they'll come back to those same plants and fertilize further.
Yeah, I've seen that research with bees, and I think it's really interesting because the conclusion was that the caffeine in the plant enhanced sort of the memory of reward. Really, really fascinating.
When we scale up these neurotransmitter effects to the macro level, what is that meaning as far as actual changes in cognition?
So there's been a lot of research on caffeine and its effects on cognitive performance. And we think of caffeine as a cognitive enhancer. So caffeine is very reliably will improve performance, especially at tasks that require sustained attention. So if you need to focus on something for a long period of time, you will do better at that task on caffeine compared to being off caffeine. It has some effects on focused attention, concentration, and its effects on memory are somewhat mixed. So we don't really see as reliable effects. And sort of, can we remember better when we're using caffeine? But as far as attention, it's a very, very clear and reliable effect. If you think about sort of pilots on long operations or, even sitting at your computer all day trying to focus on something, drugs like caffeine that are stimulants tend to improve this effect of what we call vigilance, the ability to concentrate for long periods of time. They also have effect on sort of performance as well. So it's not just the cognitive, but the motor effects. So caffeine can be used to enhance performance. Like you have to do a reaction time task or do something involving sort of a quick cognitive motor response. You'll do better if you're using caffeine.
We think about the heart palpitations and the jitters, and sometimes that you get if you drink too much caffeine, you sort of feel that overstimulated feeling. What's going on there? Like, what are the differences, I guess, between some of the sort of physical somatic effects that we feel within the body versus that wakefulness and alertness that we feel within the brain?
Well, it's the drug response curve, really, and that is it's a dose response. So, some drugs, they have certain effects at lower doses and other effects at higher doses. Now, the balance, of course, in using caffeine is because there's so much variability, people have to really pay attention to their own bodies, and they have to know, one, how much they're consuming. That can be a challenge for anyone, figuring out exactly how much caffeine you're putting into your body. Mm-hmm. But two, being aware that caffeine can be causing negative effects at higher doses. But caffeine is naturally anxiogenic. I mean, what that means is it's naturally a drug that causes anxiety. Adenosine is sort of a more sedative neuromodulator. Right? So it's actually going to cause sleepiness, relaxation. Sure. It sort of brings you down. So when you bind with those receptors and stop it from doing its job, it can be anxiogenic, and that is people feel anxiety. So yes, at low doses, people say it helps me wake up, I feel less sleepy, I can get my work done. But then at higher doses, they could feel jittery, anxious, and so forth, and not be able to sleep. So really, if people want to use caffeine in a maximal way, it can be a tricky balance, one that requires awareness. Obviously, if someone's having a very severe effect, that's going to be very uncomfortable. But fortunately, the half-life of caffeine is about 4 to 6 hours, and usually people start feeling better, over time if they sort of wait it out, as long as they haven't had a very, very high dose.
Yeah. Let's talk about that for a minute. What actually is happening within the brain at that point? The caffeine is bound into the adenosine receptors. Is the brain's internal mechanism just kind of recognizing, hey, that's not adenosine after all, and popping the caffeine out? What's going on?
No, not exactly. There is something called acute tolerance. So there are some effects in the brain that may make a drug, let's say, feel less effective at the end of the course versus the beginning. That's called acute tolerance. That's sort of when your body naturally adapts very quickly to having a drug on board. However, what causes the decrease in the subjective and performance effects would be metabolism. So our liver is responsible for metabolizing most drugs, and the caffeine is simply metabolized by the CYP enzyme system in the liver. And that's about the time it takes for half of the caffeine to be removed from the body. So metabolism of drugs is an interesting phenomenon. One of the things people don't realize is that, for example, if you're a smoker, you're likely to use about twice as much caffeine as a non-smoker. And that is because nicotine stimulates the metabolism of caffeine. So if you have nicotine in your body, then when you consume caffeine, for argument's sake, you feel it about half as much as a non-smoker. And so that's why smokers tend to use more caffeine. When people quit smoking, if they don't realize this, and I've had this happen in my practice, is that people come in and they say, quitting smoking is making me jittery and anxious, or, if they're using medications to quit, they think they attribute those symptoms to those medications, when actually it's just caffeine overdose. Because
their same amount of caffeine is hitting them twice as hard.
And that's the thing about caffeine. This is the biggest challenge I find in talking with the public is not realizing that caffeine causes symptoms. We can talk about withdrawal symptoms, we can talk about toxicity, but people often make misattributions because they consume caffeine sort of so, regularly. It's embedded in cultural routines, and they don't really think of it as a drug, a psychoactive drug.
Yeah, they sure don't.
So they could be having symptoms that are pretty uncomfortable and not even realize the source of those symptoms. And they may misattribute, let's say, caffeine withdrawal symptoms to the flu or a bad headache or or a virus. They may attribute a toxicity effect to something else, anxiety or a stress in the environment and so forth. So I think it's really important to understand exactly what caffeine does to our body, and then be able to recognize when it's not doing exactly what we want it to do.
So speaking of which, I've got a couple friends right now, and I told them that I've got my caffeine episode coming up, which I've been justifiably excited about. A couple of them mentioned that they had done or were in the process of doing caffeine detoxes. They were trying to go off caffeine for 2 weeks or 3 weeks and kind of get back to the point where their tolerance was low again. And I was just kind of wondering what your thoughts are on this. Is there a compelling reason to occasionally detox from caffeine? Is there a problem inherent in being addicted at a moderate level of consumption? Like, if you're addicted to caffeine at a couple cups of coffee a day, so what? Like, what's the answer to the so what question?
Yeah, that's a great question. I like to use the word physical dependence rather than addiction, simply because addiction, a lot of people don't know what that means, or they think it means a lot of different things.
Right. It connotes that you're, yeah.
Right. I'm not addicted because I wouldn't do all these things to get caffeine and so forth. But physical dependence on a drug, which can be separated from sort of problematic drug use, is when your body simply becomes tolerant to the drug, becomes accustomed to getting it. There are some changes in the brain and the body that we don't feel the drug as much. And also when we don't get the drug, we have that reaction we refer to as a withdrawal reaction. So with caffeine, many people are dependent on caffeine physically. They use it every day. And if they miss a day, usually if they go, let's say 12 to 24 hours without caffeine, they experience what we call caffeine withdrawal symptoms. Those symptoms are headache, fatigue, drowsiness, irritability, depression, negative mood, difficulty concentrating. And some people don't even realize flu-like symptoms. So some people will vomit, be nauseous, have severe muscle aches and pains. So this can be very uncomfortable. About 13% of the time, people are functionally impaired. They can't go to work, or they can't go to the gym, they can't take care of their children. So this is a real phenomenon. Most people get to avoid it because they consume caffeine every day, or they consume levels low enough that they may not feel it, or they're just someone who's not really that sensitive to it. There is variability as well. Some people experience very severe withdrawal symptoms. Some people experience mild. And there's some relationship with dose. So the more you use, the more likely you will experience withdrawal, and it will be more severe. Now, it doesn't take that much caffeine to become physically dependent. People don't realize this. It's only about 100 milligrams a day. So, a couple of Diet Cokes, maybe an energy drink, a small cup of coffee. That's all you need to use daily to have these symptoms when you miss a dose. Mm-hmm. So that's something for people to be aware of. And I've heard too many stories of people not realizing they were in caffeine withdrawal and it really disrupting their lives, camping trips, holidays, various sort of experiences, when all it would have taken was a dose of caffeine to make that all that bad stuff go away.
Right. Wow.
As far as, and medical procedures as well, people don't realize, they wake up from surgeries, or they used to think that headaches after surgery were sort of post-anesthesia headaches. Mm-hmm. And there's research into this, and it turns out that it had less to do with the anesthesia and much more to do with how much caffeine you typically consume. And so that these headaches people were getting after surgery were simply because we're all told don't eat or drink anything before your surgery.
Sure.
And you skip your coffee and you wake up with this pounding headache, and maybe you think, or the doctors think, it's due to the surgery and the anesthesia, but actually research has pretty clearly shown that it's just caffeine withdrawal. And so I think hospitals now are more responsive to this and will give people a cup of coffee before they're even sort of conscious again sometimes during surgery. But to answer your question about the reasons for detox, I would say physical dependence is a problem only if you don't get your caffeine, right? So if you're someone who just doesn't like to have a drug every day to feel normal, maybe you don't want to be dependent on it. Maybe you don't want to have to stop and get your cup of coffee or make it or whatever. And that's a choice people can make. Some people decide to quit entirely for, let's say, health reasons or psychological reasons, anxiety, insomnia, and so forth. Mm. And then they would have to go through sort of the weaning process off caffeine to try to diminish withdrawal. But in terms of just sort of like torturing yourself every once in a while to detox, the tolerance to caffeine is not that great. We do get tolerant to the effects, but people don't seem to increase their dose to incredible amounts, not the average person. So, a lot of people will use just like 2 cups of coffee every day for their adult life. Yeah. And they're not like, 4, 6, 10, 20, like you see with some other drugs.
Right. Like the heroin users that are, chasing that first high. It's like, coffee keeps working whether, Yeah.
Yeah, the doses of amphetamines, cocaine, like these drugs, they have very strong tolerance. People try to use more and more to get that high, and because you do become tolerant to the euphoric effects of those drugs pretty quickly. Now, as far as caffeine, something we haven't talked about, but really the primary reason people use caffeine on a daily basis is not for euphoria. It is not for some sort of beneficial effect. It's to prevent withdrawal. So we feel good because we're avoiding something bad. This has been shown. Roland Griffiths at Johns Hopkins University has done some really, really elegant and clever research showing that with certain methodologies that people, what they're willing to, what they're giving for, what they want is to avoid withdrawal. They're not so much looking for those beneficial effects of caffeine. And that is something that, we really need to discuss anytime we're discussing, performance effects, subjective effects, any sort of benefit. We always have to talk about it in the context of what's really happening with drugs. But you don't really need to detox. I mean, if you're using a moderate level and you don't have any health concerns that would be negatively affected, or medications that would interact, or psychological effects, then I would say that moderate use, under 400 milligrams a day would be fine, as long as you can procure your daily dose. You don't want to be walking around with a headache all the time.
So some of the good things about caffeine that I also have read about are that it seems to be somewhat neuroprotective against things like Parkinson's disease and some types of cancer even. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so those studies obviously are association studies. We can never randomly assign people from birth to consume or not consume caffeine. So we can't do sort of the essential tests of causality. But, in these sort of large scale epidemiological studies that try to rule out or control for many confounds, they've shown pretty robustly that caffeine use decreases the risk of Parkinson's disease, decreases the risks of, let's say, liver disease and perhaps some cancers. That's not as clear. Also, there's an association with decreasing the risk of type 2 diabetes. This is never sort of a call to begin caffeine use because, we have to remember they are correlational studies, so we don't know the exact mechanisms, but this is certainly something that's being investigated, even in terms of developing adenosine antagonists-like drugs to treat Parkinson's disease.
Makes you wonder where they find the people to actually, for those studies that are the non-caffeine users, with it being such a standard part of our society. It's like you think of, okay, what would the 10% of non-daily caffeine users, like what other commonalities would they have? It seems like that must be kind of an oddball group of people.
Well, yes, and this is what makes caffeine research, methodologically very tricky. And this is an important issue. And this is, you've mentioned, that caffeine causes tolerance, right? And you become physically dependent. We've talked about this. But the thing is, when we do a research study, when we are able to do that controlled study, where we say, okay, I want to randomly assign you to either get caffeine or not get caffeine, and then I'm going to look at your effects on, let's say, your attention or vigilance or exercise or, how you feel. Whatever your outcome variable is, you have these two groups of people, right? Somebody getting caffeine and somebody getting a placebo. And then pretty reliably, for a number of effects, you can show that caffeine sort of enhances, right? That you have better performance. Except the problem with that methodology is because 90% of people use caffeine, you're really taking caffeine users. 9 times out of 10, they tell caffeine users, don't use caffeine before coming in that morning.
Right, so they're getting sort of a rebound effect from a withdrawal state rather than adding caffeine to somebody that didn't already sort of have a tolerance built up to it.
Exactly. It's the whole sort of positive versus negative reinforcement issue. So it's that, wait, am I better off because I consumed caffeine, or am I just putting myself back to what would have been my natural baseline?
Yeah.
And so I need the drug to feel normal, as opposed to I need the drug to be better than the next person or better than myself off caffeine. It's hard to demonstrate that. So a lot of what people are experiencing in terms of feeling good, feeling alert, feeling good about the drug when they drink it in the morning, let's say, or consume it in the morning, is that maybe it's just making them feel normal again. Kind of like the heroin user will say, hey, heroin doesn't do that much for me. It just makes me feel normal,
right.
Helps me get through the day. And I think that's where a lot of people are interested in. How do you use the drug to actually get a benefit? Not just how do you use the drug to become dependent and then just need it to be back to where you would have been if you never used it in the first place.
Yeah, that's certainly the aim for, I think, people that are listening to this podcast. It's like we're all looking for ways to kind of, get one up on nature, do a little bit better than what our baseline would normally be. And so, like me as a caffeine drinker, I'd love to think that like it gives me a little bit of a boost above my baseline. But what?
Well, it might. So, when they've done, so we can't do the right study because we can do the right study, right? The right study would be you take caffeine users, because most people are, you get them off the drug for some period of time, right? So you like get them off for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, let's say. So they're not experiencing withdrawal anymore. You have them come in, you give some of them caffeine, you give some of them placebo, and you say, okay, what does caffeine do for people? Now, that's a harder study to do because first you have to get people to agree to not use caffeine for a couple of weeks. So, as a researcher, right there is a huge challenge.
Sure.
But then you could say, well, all right, well, let's not use caffeine users. Let's use non-users. So you're asking, well, who are these strange people, right? So the problem with using non-users to look at the effects of caffeine is they are non-users by choice usually, because it is so easy to get caffeine and it's so part of our culture that you almost have to avoid it. You don't have to look for it. You almost have to avoid it.
Absolutely.
And the people who are not using it tend to be hypersensitive to it. They're different. And so when you do use non-users, unfortunately, you tend to see more anxiogenic effects or anxiety-producing effects. And so therefore, it's very hard to generalize or even see the true benefits. So to get back to the issue of, well, like, how do you use the drug in a way that is maximally beneficial? I would say that you don't use it on a regular basis. And then you use the amount that, the dose that would help you do the thing it is you're trying to do. So let's say if you were an athlete, we haven't talked much about exercise performance, but there is some research showing that caffeine can enhance certain types of exercise performance. So it reduces ratings of perceived exhaustion, it increases speed and power. And this is more effective during sort of a long-term endurance type exercise. Anywhere from 30 to 90 minutes is when caffeine may have its best effects. So if you were someone trying to use it for athletic performance, you may not use it for a while. You want to lose your tolerance. You want to make sure that when you don't have it, you're not in withdrawal, because then your performance is going to be, sacrificed. It's going to be worse. And then you would use a dose that, maybe 200 milligrams or something like that, that may make you then better than you would have been off the drug. But that's tricky. Most people don't use it that way. Most people just sort of use it to ward off withdrawal, whether they realize it or not. Maybe they'll get a tiny little boost above and beyond baseline, but it's not significant. But, that would be my advice. But I think it's hard advice to sort of follow in terms of the way in which the drug is typically consumed.
Right. And so it is about a 2 to 3 week cycle then to sort of get fully clean?
Well, so withdrawal symptoms typically last anywhere from a couple of days to 2 weeks. So some people have reported headaches. Some studies show as much as 2 or 3 weeks. So, as a researcher, to be sure that someone's not still sort of in a decremented state, we would want that. Those studies are very rarely done. But yeah, for someone who's trying to quit or trying not to use the drug as much, then it would take perhaps a week or so to feel back to normal.
Well, thank you so much. It's been a really good interview, and I think just a ton of stuff. And this is, like I said, this is going to be one that's applicable to almost everybody listening, so I know people are really going to take a lot out of this.
Okay. Very nice speaking with you.
So thank you very, very much, Dr. Juliano, for that interview. I think that's probably one of the most universally relevant Smart Drug Smarts interviews that we've ever had, since 90% plus, I'm sure, of our listeners, probably this audience even plus, are caffeine users on a super frequent basis. I definitely am going to follow up with a handful of friends. If you're listening, you know who you are, who are in the midst of caffeine detoxes. I'd really be kind of curious to hear how that went and if it was, worth the effort. By whatever criteria you're considering it worth the effort. I mean, people always get excited about stuff they're doing while they're doing it. It's like anytime people sort of exert willpower and succeed at it, it's like that in itself is something worth celebrating, I guess, whether the willpower was really exerted to any worthwhile end or not. I used to have a Catholic girlfriend that got all excited about the self-denial during Lent, and it's just like, what a strange thing to get excited about. But, I do the same thing with my own stupid little things. I'm trying intermittent fasting right now, so at the moment, I'm kind of excited about that. But as promised, let's shift over to the ruthless listener retention gimmick.
Smart Drug Smarts. Ruthless listener retention gimmick.
Okay, so I promised that I would tell you something about a way to improve skills without doing what we would normally consider traditional hard work. And that is visualization. We've probably heard about this before. I know I'd heard about this in a lot of contexts, how like professional athletes will not just do all sorts of on-field exercises, but they'll sort of sit around in a woo-woo circle and visualize the little details of successful performance, whether it's shooting a basketball or running through opposing linemen or whatever it is. And there's enough, completely serious professional people that do this and that swear by it that there must be something to it. But I hadn't really looked into what some of the original research behind this is, and now I've come across it. So there was a famous study done by an Australian psychologist named Alan Richardson, and he was tracking improvements in basketball free throws on 3 separate groups. Basically, there was Group A, and they did 20 minutes of practice daily on free throws. Group B, that was not doing real physical practice, but was visualizing for 20 days in excruciating meticulous detail, making those same free throws, really going through the whole thing, the standing on the line, dribbling the ball, sweat on the brow, looking at the hoop, doing sort of a mental rehearsal of the same free throwing in their head. But they weren't touching basketballs during this time. They weren't doing anything that would be, considered real physical world practice. And then there was a third control group that didn't do any of this. Needless to say, the third control group that did nothing saw no benefits over the course of those 20 days. The group that did actual real practice got a 24% improvement overall in their free throw shooting. But what's really, really something is that the group that did the visualization only, as opposed to the real world practice, got a 23% improvement in their free throw shooting after 20 days when they actually stepped up to a real physical hoop. So a 24% improvement for physical world practice, a 23% improvement for mental world practice. So this goes to show that things like learning and even muscle memory, as far as that goes, really can take place entirely within the brain. And that's just exciting and weird to think about. It makes your mind spin off in all kinds of weird directions.
Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast where smart people talk about smart drugs.
You heard it. That is the episode. If you liked what you heard, please recommend this podcast to your friends and leave us a review on iTunes if you're feeling particularly friendly. The show notes for this episode will be online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com, including the links to everything that we talked about here. I will be back at you next week for our second edition of 2014. That'll be episode number 27. With undiminished enthusiasm for helping fine-tune the performance of your own brain. Have a great week and stay smart.
Smart Drug Smarts should be listened to for entertainment purposes only, although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not, and the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.